So total primary production, all of the primary production that's done, is the gross primary production. Net primary production, which we'll look at in lab in some detail, is that minus all the energy used by a primary producer for respiration. So the only thing an organism is going to get to eat is what's left over. So here's a view. This chart shows some of the net primary production on Earth. Okay, where if you look at the percentage of net, here's the net primary production by ecosystem, or biome actually. So we see here a grid essentially of where the highest areas of net primary production are on Earth, with the red right around the equator here obviously being one of the highest level, but also some of the near tropical areas in the world, and areas where you get a lot of on-flow moisture, and we'll talk about moisture here in a little bit. So in marine and freshwater ecosystems, we pretty much have light and nutrients that control primary production. We're going to come back to this at the end. So if we look at a couple things here in Long Island, some tests they did, if you look at the rise in inorganic phosphorus, you get a parallel rise in phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are microscopic organisms that do photosynthesis. And if you look at when they enriched it with ammonium, which is NH4, high nitrogen. They enriched it with phosphate, and they had unenriched controls. And look at which one it is. It's the nitrogen. We'll come back to this again. This experiment proves it's nitrogen that is the limiting factor, if you will, in driving population of phytoplankton. Here's one in the Sargasso Sea, okay, where when they measured primary production by measuring isotope of carbon uptake. There's lots of different ways to do it, but the controls, no growth, okay, relative uptake. When you just had nitrogen and phosphorus, you had a little bit of uptake. When you had nitrogen, phosphorus, and metals, you had that, but when you added a metal, including iron, you got this giant uptake, which means that iron is needed. Not only is it just nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, but also minerals are needed. And we're going to talk about eutrophication later. So in wetland ecosystems, there's other factors, climate factors, and we can measure that by measuring how much evaporation happens, or what's called evapotranspiration. So as we draw a graph, the more water produced by organisms, the greater the primary production, and that kind of makes sense. We can look at here's a test on land plants where we measure primary production by measuring biomass, how much is produced. The control is where nothing is added, the red. In the blue, only phosphorus was added to the ecosystem. In the black, only nitrogen added to the ecosystem. And the other one, we added nitrogen and phosphorus and got a lot more live above ground biomass. Okay, in the summer in 1980. So, we're talking about primary production. What happens to that? Well, for example, in this caterpillar, if a caterpillar eats 200 joules worth of energy, 100 joules of that never gets used at all. About 1/3 of it gets used for cell respiration, and the rest is used for growth. So only, if you do the math here, that's about 1/3, so that's about half of a third, which is a sixth, or 17% of what a caterpillar takes in is used for itself. That's important when we start looking at energy passage. So we use these things called energy pyramids to show energy passage. And you'll see that there's a general rule. And the general rule of ecology is the 10% rule. Actually, for different organisms, it's between 5 and 20%. of the energy that they take in is available to be passed on to the next organism. So remember, this is primary production, right? Primary producers. This is the amount of energy they use as they produce after respiration. So this is gross primary production minus respiration, right? Because that's the stuff they use up, and so everything else they put into themselves. They don't produce feces. So the general rule is 10% rule. That 10% of the energy that was available here, there was 1,000,000 joules of sunlight here, 10,000 available for the grasshopper, 1,000 available for the shrew, 100 available for the snake. Another way we can look at it is that something called a pyramid of biomass, where if we just mass, how much mass of primary producer do we have? Well, in an area, and we have that much mass of primary consumer. Well, remember, that's not 10%, but there's lots of other things that go into this. The amount of energy available is somewhere between 5 and 20%. This was done in a bog in Silver Springs, Florida. Sometimes you get an inverted pyramid like this, where if, let's say, I don't want to use the plankton idea, let's say this was an oak tree down here. Okay, so you have one oak tree can feed lots of primary consumers. Or we could do what's called a pyramid of numbers, where just by sheer numbers, there are 5 million primary producers, 5 million pieces of grass or grass plants, if you will, feeding 708,624 primary consumers. Say insects and bugs, which is an insect, and rabbits and things like that that eat grass. Okay, and then, I mean, there wouldn't be that many rabbits, but you can see the idea with a pyramid of numbers. So another way to look at this is, if we're going to talk about feeding the world, I just wanted to leave this out there, okay, where if people eat at a primary consumer level, you can feed a lot more people than if people feed at a secondary consumer level. So we talked about primary production, but what kinds of things keep herbivores from just exploding and taking all of the plants? Well, lots of things. The fact that plants can defend themselves, the fact that there are certain nutrients they can't get just by eating plants, or that where they are, they might not get the right nutrients, climate, and other abiotic conditions, competition between the herbivores, and competition between the herbivores within species, that they're all trying to eat the same thing, and then competition with other species. It's called the green world hypothesis. So now we want to talk about, we've been talking about energy, let's talk about nutrients. Okay, if we look at reservoir A, this chart, this talks about all the organic materials available as nutrients in living organisms and dead organisms, essentially. Well, some of them get eaten, or they eat, they decompose, they excrete, and so that they break apart into inorganic materials. You get the iron, you get the phosphorus, you get magnesium, you get carbon, you get nitrogen. Okay, organisms can take those in. So there's this back and forth. There's this back and forth pathway between reservoir A and reservoir C. Reservoir B is organic materials unavailable as nutrients. So after organisms die and they get fossilized and they get compressed over time, we get coal, oil, peat, things like that. That if we burn fossil fuels, we add to the available reservoir C. Then there's reservoir D, inorganic materials unavailable as nutrients. Mostly minerals and rocks that have always been here. And so sometimes we get formation of sedimentary rock by compression and all that stuff of inorganic materials, but often we get weathering, erosion, and those add minerals back into the available minerals for organisms. What does this have to do with anything? Well, We said at the beginning that that energy flows in nutrient cycle. So we can look at three kinds of cycles. This is one you're well familiar with, and I'm not going to spend really any much time on it, the water cycle. In the water cycle, we have transpiration from plants, evaporation from water, precipitation, and so on. And you learn about the water cycle from the time you're a youngster. We don't need to spend any more time on that one. There's also the carbon cycle, where CO2 in the atmosphere is taken out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis. This would be reservoir C here, inorganic materials available. Okay? Photosynthesis makes carbon chains or carbon skeletons, right? Carbon chains of the plant. Now animals eat those plants and use the carbon to build themselves. They have little carbon chains. That's what we're built of. We can die and decompose and become part of the detritus. Animals also breathe out carbon dioxide after cellular respiration. Okay? We have now taken from reservoir D or reservoir B and burned fossil fuels and put those back into the atmosphere. There's also the nitrogen cycle. We talk about this in Biology 1. One really important part of the nitrogen cycle are organisms called legumes. We talked about this in when we talked about bacteria, I think. On the roots of those legumes are bacteria that fix nitrogen. They take it out of the atmosphere. They convert it to things like ammonia and ammonium and nitrate and nitrite and I think I got nitrate and nitrites mixed, that are now things that organisms can take in. So organisms can take in nitrogen, an animal can eat the legume, that gets it nitrogen. And now the animal, what do we use nitrogen for? Let's review that. Nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are all water here. Carbon. Nitrogen is a really important part of proteins. In fact, you can't make proteins without it. And DNA. So, we have to have the ability to fix nitrogen. There's also the ability to put it back, called denitrification. And there are bacteria in the soil that do that also. The last of the major nutrients is phosphorus. Phosphorus, this cycle is kind of argued about a lot. Rocks get rained on and phosphorus leaches into the water. Okay, plants can uptake phosphorus through their roots. And remember before we showed that phosphorus plus nitrogen are two of the most important things that plants need. Okay, and of course animals get phosphorus by eating a plant and then decompose, and decomposers get phosphorus that way. So those are the big term is biogeochemical cycles. Okay, of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen make water, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So here's the general idea that geologic processes contribute to an abiotic reservoir of nutrients. Okay, they become available to producers. Producers take them in. Plants take in these things somehow. Okay, the abiotic reservoir could be in the air, it could be in the soil, it could be whatever. Okay, producers eat them, pass them to consumers. They all die, become part of the abiotic reservoir again. Some of which die and get compressed and end up part of the earth again, and so on. Now, this leads to a discussion of what happens if this is disturbed. And so if we look at an experiment that was done, this experiment was done in something called the Hubbard Brook Forest, where they deforested part of a watershed. They cut the trees down in 1965, in June of 1965, in one area. And so the area they didn't do it in is called the control. It's labeled down here. And the deforested area is up here. And what they measured was how much nitrate was in the runoff. They measured the outflow. They used concrete dams and weirs, and they measured in here how much nitrate came through there. And because the trees were cut down, they were not anymore taking nitrogen out of the soil, and look at what happened. Okay? That's a pretty interesting experiment. So we can extend that then, because what we do as humans, and I'm going to have to go 2 slides up and then skip back. Okay? What we've done as humans is, because agriculture removes nutrients from the ecosystem, agriculture, farming, and nitrogen is the one that plants take up, agriculture really impacts that cycle, so we put fertilizer on there. But here's what happens when we do that. We put fertilizer on the soil, we get runoff. And that runoff can lead to, okay, and this nitrogen effect, there's 2 different kinds of ecosystems. Aquatic, there's eutrophic, where there's lots of plant growth because of very high nitrogen and phosphorus amounts. That'd be Crockery Lake and the school pond. Crockery Lake, if you've ever been there, or Cranberry Lake, or any of the small lakes right around here, there's lots of runoff of nitrogen fertilizers into the school pond, from the farm right next door, whatever. Okay, if you think about Cranberry Lake, if you've been there, it's basically down in all around it is farmland except for a few houses. Oligotrophic lakes, like Lake Michigan, is where the primary producer is phytoplankton. There's no real weeds. You can go to Lake Michigan and you don't find weeds really at all. That's because there's not so much nitrogen per unit. So that lake is oligotrophic. And there's lots of things that can affect that. Okay, but eutrophication is when, if you look at our school pond, that's what's happening to it. So many nutrients are flowing into it that you get all kinds of primary production in that pond. So then also we talk about toxins that are abiotic, but we have put them into the environment. And when we put toxins into the environment, one of the problems is they get more concentrated the higher up you go in the trophic levels. It's called biological magnification. So if we look at this chart, okay, if we dump a bunch of toxins in the water, the phytoplankton take in very small amounts. The things that eat the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, they eat more than one phytoplankton. They might eat 100 or 10, and now they have 10 times the amount of that toxin in their tissues. A smelt might eat 10 of these, and now it has 10 more times because those toxins don't go anywhere. They're preserved in the tissues. So then a lake trout might eat 4 or 5 smelt, and now it has that much of the toxin in its tissues. And then a herring gull is the bird that maybe eats lake trout eggs or whatever, and it's been feeding on them and feeding on them and feeding on them. The eggshells get really weak because of all the concentration of toxin. PCBs was the one that's measured here, but this is true of any ecosystem. That's called biological magnification. Humans have affected ecosystems by adding carbon dioxide to the ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but a lot of people attribute the greenhouse effect and the rise in global temperatures to the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And we can argue about that a little bit and talk about that topic in class. So that's the discussion of ecosystems.